My parents left me nothing, but gave everything to my brother. I still remember the day I opened the lawyer's letter like it was yesterday. The envelope heavy in my hands, my fingers trembling as if they knew the words inside would fracture everything I thought I understood about family. My brother, the golden child, the one who had always been perfect in their eyes, was named sole heir to the house, the savings, even the vacation cabin by the lake that I had spent countless summers exploring with my parents. And me? I got nothing. Not a penny, not a keepsake, not even a simple acknowledgement. Just silence. I sank to the floor, the letter clutched to my chest, feeling the weight of betrayal crash down like a wave I couldn't swim against. I remembered the years I had spent caring for them, the nights I sat by my mother's hospital bed when she was sick, the hours I devoted to helping my father with paperwork and errands, the sacrifices I had made thinking that love and loyalty would matter, that it would count for something. And yet here I was, counted for nothing. I stared at the walls of my small apartment, feeling a strange mix of disbelief and rage. My brother had always been charming, smooth, the kind of person who could make everyone laugh while quietly manipulating situations to his advantage. I had always suspected he was favored, but I never imagined it was this blatant, this cruel. I thought about confronting my parents before they passed, but the words never came out. How do you ask someone, the people who raised you, why they value one child over another? I had lived my life assuming love was unconditional, only to have that illusion shattered in a single stroke of a pen. The first days after learning the truth were a blur. I avoided my brother, who seemed almost gleeful when he casually mentioned his inheritance. He didn't need to rub it in. Just existing, walking around with that smug air, was enough to pierce me. Friends tried to comfort me, but they didn't understand. This wasn't just about money. It was about validation, about being seen, about knowing that all those years of care and sacrifice had meant something. I tried to write my feelings down, journaling late into the night, trying to make sense of the anger, the heartbreak, the simmering desire for justice that I couldn't yet articulate. Eventually, I realized that wallowing in resentment would get me nowhere. I needed a plan, not just to reclaim what I had lost, but to assert my worth, to show that I wasn't invisible, and that I could fight back against the system of favoritism that had left me destitute in my parents' eyes. I started with research, poring over the legal documents, the will, any loophole or precedent I could find. There were none. My parents had been meticulous, deliberate, leaving instructions so precise there was no ambiguity. Everything pointed to my brother, leaving me with nothing but a growing sense of injustice and a determination that bordered on obsession. I considered my options. Confrontation was inevitable. I needed to speak to him, to the lawyer, to anyone who might help me understand why I had been erased from my family's legacy. When I finally saw my brother, it was at a small family gathering I had reluctantly attended, forced by the unspoken expectation that I remain civil. He greeted me with that same confident smile, unaware or maybe aware of the storm brewing behind my calm exterior. "Hey sis," he said, casually flipping through his phone. "Have you seen the new cabin plans? Pretty exciting, right?" My hands clenched into fists. Every word, every casual mention of his inheritance was a dagger. I realized then that this wasn't going to be easy. This wasn't a simple misunderstanding. This was deliberate, calculated favoritism. I swallowed my pride, forced a smile, and said nothing, retreating to the far side of the room, nursing my anger and humiliation like a wound. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced my small apartment, the shadows of the furniture stretching across the walls, mirroring the darkness that had settled in my chest. How could parents, the people who were supposed to love me unconditionally, leave me nothing? How could the person I had shared a room with, who I had once confided in and trusted, receive everything I had dreamed of? I thought about my parents' faces, their expressions over the years, the subtle ways they had always favored him, smiles that lingered too long, praise that seemed measured and exact. I had noticed it before, but I had brushed it off, excusing it as natural, as harmless. But it wasn't harmless. It had been a pattern, a preparation for this ultimate act of erasure. Anger turned to resolve. I began plotting how I could take control of my own life, independent of the legacy they had withheld. If they would not provide for me, I would provide for myself. I drafted plans for new investments, new career paths, ways to build wealth and security without depending on the crumbs they had denied me. And yet, even as I nurtured these plans, the wound of betrayal remained raw. I realized that the fight wasn't just about money. It was about recognition, respect, and reclaiming my sense of identity. I had to find a way to assert that I mattered, that my life, my effort, and my love were not invisible simply because my parents chose to favor my brother. I started small, taking on freelance projects, investing in a small property, and slowly building a network of professional contacts who valued me for my skills, not my inheritance. Every success, no matter how minor, felt like a small victory over the shadow my parents had cast. But then came the calls from extended family members, the whispers at reunions, the guilt-laden questions from cousins and aunts. Are you really going to let him have everything? Don't you want to reconcile? He's family, after all. Every comment was like salt on a wound. People didn't see my fight as personal growth or resilience. They saw it as selfishness or bitterness. I began to realize that claiming what was rightfully mine, even in spirit, came at the cost of misunderstanding, judgment, and isolation. And yet I could not turn back. The more I invested in my independence, the clearer it became that I had to fight, not just for money or property, but for validation, for my voice, and for the respect I had been denied my entire life. One night, as I reviewed my plans for a new business venture, a realization struck me. My parents' favoritism, my brother's smug confidence, even the harsh judgment of relatives, none of it could define me. I could choose my path, claim my own successes, and build a life that mattered on my own terms. That was the true inheritance, the one they could never take away. But even with this epiphany, anger and grief lingered. I still longed for an explanation, a conversation that might have brought closure. I wanted to understand why they had favored him, why they had left me nothing, why love had felt conditional. I imagined confronting them one last time, but they were gone, leaving me with memories, a broken sense of fairness, and the stark reality that some questions have no answers. And so I turned my focus outward. I began networking, investing, building projects that reflected my ambition and skill. Each step felt like reclaiming a piece of myself, proving that I could thrive without their approval, without their inheritance. I realized that independence was its own kind of justice, a way to rise above favoritism and show, through action, that I was not defined by the choices of others. Am I wrong for feeling betrayed? For grieving the inheritance that never came to me? I have asked myself this countless times, oscillating between bitterness and resolve. But in the quiet moments, when I see the progress I've made, the small victories that no one else may notice, I know that I am not wrong. I am reclaiming my life, asserting my value, and proving that worth is not determined by the will of others, but by the courage to create, persist, and thrive despite betrayal. My parents may have left me nothing, but I am building something far more powerful, a legacy of my own, forged in resilience, independence, and unwavering determination. And one day, when my brother or anyone else looks at what I've built, they will see that inheritance is not given. It is earned, shaped by effort, integrity, and the refusal to be diminished by the favoritism of others. The tension between my brother and me didn't take long to surface. Family gatherings became minefields, every interaction loaded with unspoken accusations and subtle digs. At first, I tried to act normal, pretending that his inheritance didn't sting, that I was indifferent to the fact that everything I had dreamed of owning was now in his hands. But the facade quickly cracked. During one holiday dinner, my uncle, ever the mediator, made a comment about sharing and generosity that was clearly aimed at me. My brother, with that infuriating smile, chimed in, "Well, I've always tried to be generous, haven't I?" I felt a flush of rage, my chest tightening. Generous? He had everything handed to him, while I had spent years building my life from scratch, earning every opportunity, every dollar. I wanted to lash out, to scream, to demand that someone finally see the injustice, but I forced myself to stay composed. I had learned early on that anger rarely wins battles, it only feeds them. Instead, I chose strategy. I began documenting every interaction, every mention of the inheritance, every comment that could serve as evidence of favoritism or unfair treatment. I consulted my lawyer, not to challenge the will, because that was airtight, but to understand my rights and ensure I was prepared if my brother attempted to exploit the situation further. And he tried. Almost immediately, he began hinting to extended family members that I was bitter or jealous, subtly framing me as the problem rather than acknowledging the reality of the unfair distribution. I felt my stomach twist in frustration. It wasn't enough that I had been wronged. Now I had to fight the narrative that I was the villain. One afternoon, my father's old friend, someone I had considered an ally, approached me cautiously. "You know, your brother is planning to sell the cabin," he said, lowering his voice. "And he might try to cut you out entirely from anything he leaves behind next." My hands shook as the words sank in. This was more than favoritism. It was an active attempt to erase me from the family legacy. I realized that waiting for validation from others, or hoping that my brother would see reason, was futile. I needed to act. I poured myself into work, into building a life that could not be diminished by inheritance alone. I started investing in a small business, learning the intricacies of finance, negotiation, and strategy. Every success, every incremental gain, became a form of personal justice, a way to assert that I was not defined by what my parents had given or withheld. But the personal victories did not shield me from pain. Every holiday, every birthday, every family event reminded me of what I had lost. I would watch my brother receive gifts, praise, and attention, feeling the hollow ache of exclusion. One particularly bitter winter, I confronted him directly. We were alone in the kitchen of my parents' old house, now emptied of their presence but still heavy with memories. "Why?" I demanded, my voice tight with emotion. "Why did they leave me nothing? Why does it feel like you were rewarded for being you while I was punished for—" "What exactly?" He looked at me, his expression carefully neutral, as if he had rehearsed this response 1,000 times. "It's not like that," he said smoothly. "They loved you too. Maybe they just thought you could handle life on your own. They trusted me to manage the estate. That's all." I laughed bitterly, a sound that surprised even me. Handle life on my own? I've been handling it my entire adult life. But handling it doesn't mean being invisible. It doesn't mean being erased. You got everything handed to you, and now you're telling me it's about trust. He shrugged, that infuriating nonchalance that had made me resent him for years. "Look, it's not personal. They made their decisions. You can't change that." I stormed out, my hands shaking, my mind racing. I realized that he would never truly understand, that reasoning with him was useless. The battle had shifted from seeking explanations to asserting my own independence, my own power. I threw myself into my projects, into building wealth and stability on my terms. Each step became a way to reclaim control over a life that had been overshadowed by favoritism and unfair treatment. Over time, I noticed subtle shifts in the family dynamic. My cousins, who had once parroted my brother's narrative, began to see me differently. They noticed the business I had launched, the investments I had made, the determination in my eyes. They began to ask questions, to show respect that had been denied before. I realized that my struggle was not just about inheritance. It was about recognition, about proving my worth through action, rather than relying on validation from parents who had long passed. One day, I received a message from a distant aunt, someone I had barely spoken to in years. "I've been watching what you've done," she wrote. "Your parents may have favored your brother, but you are carving your own path. I'm proud of you." Her words hit me harder than any legal victory ever could. For the first time, I felt that my efforts, my struggle, my determination, were being seen and acknowledged. It was a validation I had yearned for since receiving that devastating letter. Despite these small victories, the tension with my brother never fully dissipated. Every interaction remained charged, every conversation a potential battlefield. But I learned to navigate it with grace, using strategy, patience, and emotional control as my weapons. I realized that power doesn't always come from inheritance. It comes from resilience, intelligence, and the courage to define your own life. As the months passed, I began documenting my journey, not just for myself, but as a record of resilience. Each journal entry detailed the frustrations, the confrontations, and the moments of triumph. I reflected on how betrayal, favoritism, and exclusion had shaped me, and how I could use those experiences to forge a life of independence and integrity. One evening, I walked past the family home, the one my brother now owned entirely. I stood on the sidewalk, looking up at the windows, imagining the life inside, the laughter, the memories, and the legacy that had been denied me. I realized that my pain was intertwined with love, that my anger stemmed from a deep desire for fairness, and that my determination was fueled by the refusal to be defined by someone else's fortune. I understood then that the inheritance I truly needed was not money, property, or material assets. It was self-respect, autonomy, and the ability to create a life that mattered on my own terms. And so I turned away from the house, from the legacy that had been withheld, and focused on building my own. I invested in opportunities, nurtured relationships, and cultivated a life that no legal document could diminish. Each step was an assertion of my worth, a declaration that my parents' favoritism would not dictate my destiny. In reflecting on everything, the betrayal, the favoritism, the bitter confrontations, I realized that I had learned one of life's harshest lessons. Sometimes those who should support you the most will disappoint you, and sometimes the people you thought were allies will betray you. But within that harsh truth lies an opportunity to rise, to reclaim power, and to define your life by your own actions, not by the limitations imposed by others. Am I wrong for feeling bitter, for grieving what was denied to me? I have asked myself this countless times. And yet, in the quiet of my apartment, when I look at the progress I've made and the life I've built, I know the answer. I am not wrong. I am resilient, capable, and determined. I am carving my own path, independent of the inheritance, independent of my brother, independent of the favoritism that sought to diminish me. And in that realization, I found a strange peace, a quiet sense of empowerment, and the knowledge that true worth is earned, nurtured and defined by courage, action, and perseverance, not by what is handed down or withheld. The tension between my brother and me reached a boiling point when I realized that subtle indignities were no longer enough to vent my frustration. I needed to take action. Not out of revenge, not out of spite, but out of necessity. I had to assert myself publicly, to make sure the world saw that I wasn't the passive, invisible child my parents had tried to cast me as. I began with small legal consultations, exploring every possible avenue, not to challenge the will directly, because it was unassailable, but to understand if there were any discrepancies, any loopholes, any way to establish a fair acknowledgement of my contributions to the family over the years. Every meeting with lawyers, every late-night phone call, and every document I examined felt like reclaiming a piece of my dignity, a way to assert that my life mattered as much as my brother's. But preparation alone couldn't shield me from the emotional toll. Each family gathering became a test of endurance. I could feel my brother's smug eyes on me, every word he spoke dripping with the confidence of someone who had been handed the world while I had to fight for scraps. One evening, at a cousin's wedding, the tension erupted. My brother casually announced plans to sell the family cabin, the one I had spent countless summers exploring, and the crowd reacted with excitement, laughter, and congratulations. I could feel my chest tighten, my hands clenching into fists under the table. The desire to yell, to expose his selfishness, surged like wildfire, but I forced myself to breathe. I had learned that raw emotion was dangerous. It could make me appear irrational, jealous, or unstable, which was exactly the narrative my brother wanted. Instead, I excused myself, retreating to a quiet corner and called my lawyer. By the next week, I had formal documentation in place, asserting my role in preserving the family legacy through care, management, and prior contributions. It wasn't about money. It was about recognition, about establishing that I was not invisible, about proving that my efforts and presence in our parents' lives mattered legally, even if they hadn't acknowledged it personally. As I filed the paperwork, a wave of relief mixed with anxiety washed over me. For the first time, I felt proactive rather than reactive. I was taking control of my narrative, asserting my voice, and refusing to be diminished. My brother's response was predictable: indignation, thinly veiled anger, and attempts to rally the rest of the family to his side. "Why are you making this complicated?" he demanded during one heated phone call. "You had your chance, you got nothing, and now you're trying to start drama?" His words made my blood boil, but I kept my voice calm. "I'm not trying to start drama. I'm asserting my rights, something that should have been respected long ago. This isn't about fighting you. It's about reclaiming the acknowledgement I deserve." The conversation ended abruptly, his fury simmering on the other end of the line, but I felt a small surge of triumph. I had stood my ground, spoken my truth, and refused to be intimidated. The weeks that followed were a trial in patience. Extended family members, some quietly supportive and others openly critical, weighed in. I received messages, calls, and even surprise visits from relatives who wanted to sway me one way or another. I realized that this struggle had grown beyond me and my brother. It had become a public narrative, a test of my character in the eyes of the entire family. I began to document everything meticulously: interactions, conversations, instances where my contributions had been ignored or dismissed, and proof of my efforts to maintain family assets and relationships. This documentation wasn't just for legal purposes. It became my shield, my armor against the onslaught of judgment, whispers, and attempts to paint me as the bitter sibling. As months passed, the dynamic began to shift. My brother, who had once seemed untouchable, started to falter. The subtle cracks in his confidence became visible during family gatherings, in phone calls that were sharper and more defensive, in the way he avoided discussing the inheritance directly with me. I knew that he realized the battle was no longer about the material assets. It was about my visibility, my voice, and my refusal to be erased. And then, the turning point came. During a family reunion at the lake, where the cabin still stood, I confronted him with a calm, measured explanation of my actions and intentions. "I'm not here to fight you for the house or the money," I said, my voice steady. "I'm here to assert that I mattered, that my life, my sacrifices, and my presence in this family are not to be dismissed. I want recognition, nothing more, nothing less." The words hung in the air like a challenge, a declaration of self-worth that could not be ignored. The silence that followed was thick, charged, and almost unbearable. I could feel the tension radiating from him, from the cousins, from the aunts and uncles who had gathered around. But slowly, imperceptibly, I noticed a change. My brother's jaw tightened, his usual smugness replaced by something quieter, almost grudgingly respectful. That night, as I walked along the shore, the moonlight reflecting on the water, I felt a small sense of victory. Not because I had won a confrontation, but because I had asserted myself with dignity, clarity, and unwavering resolve. The path to independence was no longer abstract. It was tangible, and I had walked it with deliberate steps. Over the following months, I focused on building my life. I invested wisely, nurtured professional relationships, and expanded my small business into a thriving enterprise. Each accomplishment became a statement. I could succeed without inheritance, without favoritism, without parental validation. My identity, my worth, my legacy, these were mine to define. And yet, even as I prospered, the emotional wounds remained. I struggled with occasional feelings of inadequacy, flashbacks to the injustice, and pangs of longing for a connection that had always been conditional. Therapy became a cornerstone of my recovery, helping me process the betrayal, the favoritism, and the sense of invisibility that had haunted me since I first opened that devastating lawyer's letter. Through reflection and guidance, I began to separate my self-worth from the material inheritance I had been denied. I learned that value is not determined by what is handed to you, but by the courage to act, the discipline to build, and the resilience to thrive despite adversity. One afternoon, a cousin approached me quietly at a family brunch, her voice hesitant. "I just wanted to say, you've done amazing things. I see all the effort you've put in, and I think it's incredible. I'm sorry for not seeing it before." Her words hit me harder than I expected. It wasn't just acknowledgement. It was validation that my fight, my struggle, and my resilience were being recognized. I realized that the inheritance I had been denied had inadvertently propelled me toward independence, self-sufficiency, and a life that my parents could never have dictated. And in that, there was a sense of triumph far greater than any material possession could provide. By the end of the year, I had not only solidified my financial independence, but also begun to repair fractured family relationships on my own terms. I engaged in careful, measured communication with my brother, maintaining boundaries while asserting my voice. He, begrudgingly, began to treat me with a cautious respect he had never afforded before. And through it all, I discovered a profound truth. Standing firm, demanding recognition, and refusing to be diminished by favoritism is not selfish. It is necessary for survival, growth, and the preservation of dignity. Reflecting on the journey, I realized that the initial betrayal, the pain of exclusion, and the bitterness of favoritism had become the catalysts for my transformation. The inheritance I lacked was replaced by something far more enduring: autonomy, resilience, and the knowledge that I could define my life without depending on the whims of others. Am I wrong for feeling anger? For grieving what was withheld? And for asserting my worth so publicly? I've asked myself this countless times, but now I know the answer. I am not wrong. I acted with courage, intelligence, and integrity. I reclaimed my narrative, my voice, and my identity, and in doing so, I proved that true inheritance is not measured by money, property, or favoritism, but by the ability to create, endure, and rise above injustice. The months following my confrontation with my brother were a period of both reflection and intense personal growth. I had achieved a sense of stability that I had never known before, and for the first time, I felt genuinely in control of my life. My business was thriving, my investments were growing steadily, and I had begun to establish a circle of friends and mentors who valued me for who I was, rather than the inheritance I had, or hadn't, received. Yet even amidst these successes, there were moments of quiet vulnerability. I would occasionally catch myself staring at old family photographs, remembering how things used to be, the laughter and warmth that had once felt so effortless. The pain of exclusion lingered, like an echo I could not fully silence. One rainy evening, I found myself back at the family cabin, now officially in my brother's possession. I had driven down not out of nostalgia, but to confront my feelings one last time, to draw a line between the past and the life I was building. I walked through the room slowly, touching the worn wooden walls, recalling memories of summers spent there, of laughter shared with cousins and friends, of my parents' quiet smiles. And yet, I also acknowledged the bitterness, the unfairness, and the feeling of being overlooked. Standing in the living room, I spoke aloud, not to anyone but to myself. This place doesn't define me. Their choices don't define me. I define me. It was a declaration, a mantra, a release. That day, I left the cabin not with anger, but with a sense of closure. I realized that the power my parents and my brother had held over me was only as strong as I allowed it to be. By taking control of my narrative, by asserting my worth, and by refusing to be diminished, I had reclaimed the authority over my life that had been unfairly challenged. The emotional weight began to lift, replaced by a quiet determination to continue forging a path that was entirely my own. As I immersed myself further into my work and personal projects, I noticed subtle yet meaningful changes in my family. My cousins, who had once been swayed by my brother's narrative, began to seek my counsel on financial matters and life choices. They admired my resilience, my capacity to navigate adversity, and the clarity with which I approached challenges. It was as if my actions had rewritten the script of my place within the family, not through inheritance or favoritism, but through consistent demonstration of capability, intelligence, and moral strength. My relationship with my brother, while still complicated, also shifted. The confrontations that had once defined us gradually gave way to cautious acknowledgement. He began to recognize, perhaps grudgingly, that I was no longer the passive, invisible sibling. He would occasionally reach out, asking advice on business decisions or offering updates on the family property. And while his tone still carried traces of defensiveness, it was clear that the power dynamic had changed. I had moved from being sidelined to being a respected, if still wary, participant in the family's sphere. Beyond family dynamics, I found that my personal life had transformed in profound ways. I had cultivated a sense of self-worth that was independent of external validation, and this confidence permeated every aspect of my interactions, professional, social, and romantic. I learned to set boundaries firmly, to demand respect, and to refuse participation in relationships or arrangements that did not honor my dignity. And yet, the journey was not without reflection on my own vulnerabilities. I spent countless hours journaling, exploring the impact of favoritism, exclusion, and perceived betrayal on my psyche. I confronted the anger, the jealousy, and the grief, allowing myself to process them fully rather than suppress them. Through this introspection, I realized that the most significant inheritance my parents had inadvertently provided was not material but experiential. The challenge of overcoming adversity, the resilience forged through being underestimated, and the strength developed by asserting my worth in the face of unfairness. One spring morning, I received a letter from my father's attorney, notifying me of the final legal settlement regarding the family estate. My brother had completed all transfers, and while I still had no claim to the property or monetary inheritance, there was a formal acknowledgement of my contributions to the family over the years. It was a small gesture, but profoundly symbolic. I felt a swell of emotion. Not triumph in the traditional sense, but validation that my efforts, perseverance, and integrity had been recognized. I realized that the battles I had fought were never truly about money or property. They had been about asserting my identity, demanding acknowledgement, and reclaiming agency over my life. The sense of empowerment that followed was intoxicating. I no longer measured my worth by what was given or withheld. Instead, I measured it by the actions I took, the risks I embraced, and the life I built despite adversity. The journey also taught me the importance of empathy and understanding. I came to recognize that my brother's behavior, while hurtful, was shaped by his own experiences, insecurities, and upbringing. This perspective did not excuse the favoritism or the pain it caused, but it allowed me to engage with him without the corrosive anger that had once consumed me. In family gatherings that followed, I found a newfound ability to participate without resentment, to engage without bitterness, and to assert my voice without fear. I had established my position not through confrontation alone, but through the consistent demonstration of competence, resilience, and moral clarity. Looking back, I understood that my parents' decision to favor my brother had been devastating, yet it had propelled me toward self-sufficiency and independence in ways that might never have occurred otherwise. The lessons were clear. Life's injustices, while painful, can catalyze growth. Resilience can be forged through adversity, and true inheritance is measured not in material wealth, but in the strength, integrity, and self-determination cultivated along the way. One quiet evening, as I sat by the window in my own apartment, watching the city lights shimmer, I reflected on everything: the heartbreak, the battles, the victories both large and small. I realized that my life, once overshadowed by favoritism and exclusion, had been transformed into a story of empowerment. I had learned to define my own legacy, independent of the inheritance I had been denied. And in that realization, I found peace. I knew that the past, with all its pain, had been a teacher. My brother, my family, my parents, they had all played a role, willingly or not, in shaping the person I had become. I had taken what could have been a lifetime of bitterness and turned it into fuel for growth, ambition, and self-respect. And so, as the night deepened, I closed my eyes with a sense of quiet triumph, knowing that while I had not inherited my parents' wealth, I had inherited something far more valuable: the knowledge that I am capable, resilient, and worthy of every success I create. Am I wrong for feeling proud of how far I've come? For embracing the life I've built despite adversity? For asserting my worth when others tried to deny it? I have asked myself this many times, and each time, the answer is clear. I am not wrong. I am empowered. I am self-determined. And I am free to define my own legacy. One built on courage, perseverance, and unwavering belief in myself. The past may have sought to define me, but I have rewritten my story. Not through inheritance, not through favor, but through the choices I've made and the life I've forged. And in that, I found not only closure, but the profound understanding that the truest measure of a life well lived is the strength to rise above injustice and claim your own place in the world.